She stood in the grand hall of Thornwood as the last guests departed, a silver tray balanced in her hands, and waited for her husband to look at her. He did not. Alexander Ashford, the Duke of Thornwood, stood near the fireplace speaking in low tones with his steward, his broad shoulders turned completely away from where she lingered near the doorway. She had been his wife for 8 months, and still he passed her each day with the same distant courtesy one might offer a distant cousin one barely recalled. A footman brushed past, nearly jostling the tray from her fingers, and she steadied it before the teacup slid. The small noise made the steward glance up. The Duke did not. "Shall I leave these in the morning room, Your Grace?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the quiet polish her governess had drilled into her since childhood. Alexander waved a hand without turning. "Wherever you like." He did not even say her name. Ilara, such a small, hopeful sound. He had spoken it perhaps 4 times since their wedding day. She set the tray down herself on a side table because the servants had long since stopped rushing to assist a duchess the master ignored, and she climbed the winding stone stairs alone. The loneliness was not a sudden storm. It was a slow, gray drizzle that soaked through her bones until she could not remember what warmth felt like. She paused on the landing and pressed her palm flat against the cold wall, steadying herself. Somewhere deep in her trunk, wrapped in a scrap of faded velvet, lay a tiny silver ring a boy had given her under an old oak tree 17 years ago. She had been 7 years old. He had been 10, a serious boy with wind-tossed dark hair who had come with his parents to visit her father's modest estate in Somerset. She could still recall his solemn voice as he'd pushed the ring onto her thumb, far too big, and made a vow. "I'll come back for you, Ellie. I'll marry you when we're grown, swear it." Ellie, he had called her Ellie then because her full name had been too long for his youthful tongue. She had believed him with every fiber of her small, trusting heart. Letters had come for a year, stilted and formal in a boy's handwriting, and then his parents died in a carriage accident on the Dover Road, and the letters stopped. She'd heard nothing more until 15 years later, when her father's mounting debts forced her family to accept a coldly practical marriage proposal from the new Duke of Thornwood, a man who had supposedly requested her hand after a single, indifferent glance at her portrait. She had arrived at Thornwood Hall clutching the secret hope that he remembered. He did not. The boy who had called her Ellie was buried somewhere beneath the imposing, silver-eyed stranger who now wore the title like armor, and he had never once looked at her with even a flicker of recognition. That was the first wound. The second came more quietly. It happened 4 months into the marriage, on a gray November afternoon when she had ventured into his private study to fetch a book. A stack of letters lay on his desk, and the topmost one lay open, addressed to a London solicitor. Her eyes, unpracticed in deceit, had caught the words before she could look away. Still no trace of the anonymous benefactor who discharged the estate's debt 5 years ago. "I am determined to find this person and repay every shilling with proper gratitude. Inform me the moment any new information surfaces." She had stood frozen, the paper trembling in her hand. 5 years ago, Thornwood had been on the edge of financial ruin. Everyone in society had whispered it. And 5 years ago, a young woman named Ilara Pemberton had sold her late mother's most treasured diamond necklace, a piece meant for her dowry, and arranged through a trusted solicitor to pay off the crushing debt anonymously. She had done it because the estate belonged to the boy who had once promised her the world, even if he no longer remembered. She had done it because the thought of him losing everything had been unbearable. Now she was his wife, living in the very house she had secretly saved, and he walked past her every morning in search of a ghostly benefactor he would never think to find standing at his own breakfast table. She never told him. The humiliation of being an unwanted wife was sharp enough. To confess and have him think she expected gratitude or, worse, love, would destroy the last shred of her dignity. So she tucked the secret deep inside her heart and went on with the quiet, invisible work of being a duchess no one truly saw. The months that followed shaped her into something harder and softer at once. Harder, because she learned to stop waiting by windows for a husband who never came home before midnight. Softer, because she poured her unused affection into the tenant families who lived on the estate's outlying farms. At first, the steward was bewildered when the new duchess began visiting cottages with baskets of food and medicine. Then the tenants themselves grew bewildered, then grateful. She learned the names of every child, remembered which grandmother suffered from rheumatism, and sat for hours reading to a blind old farmer who had once worked the Thornwood lands in his youth. The staff inside the great house noticed the change too. The cook, Mrs. Hardwick, began setting aside a warm plate for the Duchess's late returns. The head groom silently polished her saddle until it gleamed, even though the master never accompanied her on rides. Slowly, without any grand declaration, Alara became the heart of Thornwood. Everyone, it seemed, noticed except her husband. Until the afternoon, Lord Henry Cavendish arrived. Henry was Alexander's younger cousin, a man of easy smiles and warm brown eyes, whose charm was as effortless as breathing. He came to Thornwood for a fortnight's visit after a long tour of the continent, and within 2 hours of his arrival, he had done what Alexander had not done in 8 months. He looked at Alara as if she were the most interesting person in the room. They met properly in the library, where she was cataloging a box of old books for the village school she planned to establish. Henry strolled in, saw her perched on a ladder with dust on her nose, and laughed, not unkindly, but with genuine delight. Cousin Alexander failed to mention his duchess was a scholar, he said, steadying the ladder with one hand. Shall I help, or am I only permitted to admire from below? Alara climbed down, flustered. I am only sorting. The task is hardly admirable. On the contrary, practicality in a duchess is rarer than emeralds. His smile softened. You are not what I expected. She did not know how to answer. No one in this house had ever looked at her long enough to form expectations. Over the days that followed, Henry's presence became a quiet sunbeam in the great shadowed house. He walked with her to the village, listened earnestly as she explained her plans for the school, and made her laugh, genuinely laugh, for the first time since she had arrived at Thornwood. At dinner, he drew her into conversation with gentle questions, and she found herself speaking of her childhood in Somerset, her love of old music, her secret wish to learn watercolor painting. Alexander sat at the head of the table, cutting his meat into precise pieces, his silver eyes flickering toward them with an unreadable expression she could not name. She did not think it could be jealousy. Jealousy required caring, and she had long ago accepted that her husband cared for nothing but his estate, his secrets, and a forgotten benefactor he would never find. But the first crack in his indifference appeared on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks into Henry's stay. The three of them had been invited to a small assembly in the nearby market town, an informal affair hosted by a local baronet. Alara wore a gown of pale sea-green silk, a color that turned her quiet gray eyes to something close to silver. She had not expected Alexander to attend. He rarely accepted social invitations. Yet when she descended the staircase, he stood in the hall, already gloved and waiting, his gaze lifting to her with an intensity that made her pause on the bottom step. He said nothing, not a compliment, not a greeting, but his eyes held hers for 3 full heartbeats before he turned and offered his arm. At the assembly, Henry danced with her twice. The first was a spirited country reel during which she laughed breathlessly, her cheeks pink and her carefully pinned hair threatening to slip free. The second was a slower waltz, and as they turned in graceful circles, Henry leaned close and murmured something that made her smile, a small private smile that dimpled her cheek. From across the room, Alexander watched. His jaw was set. His gloved hand gripped his untouched glass of claret so tightly the stem threatened to snap. When the waltz ended, He crossed the floor in long, deliberate strides and positioned himself directly between Alara and his cousin. "My wife and I will return to the hall now," he said, his voice carrying the cool authority of a man unused to contradiction. "The hour grows late." Henry's eyebrows lifted, but he bowed with flawless courtesy. "Of course, cousin, I shall find my own way back. Your Duchess has been delightful company." The carriage ride home was silent, but the silence was different from the empty, echoing quiet she had grown accustomed to. It was thick, charged. Alexander sat across from her, his face half-lit by the passing carriage lamps, and she could feel his gaze on her like a weight. She kept her own eyes fixed on her clasped hands, her heart beating a strange, painful rhythm. When they reached Thornwood, he helped her down from the carriage with a grip that lingered a moment too long before releasing her. "Good night, Alara," he said. He said her name. For the first time in months, he said her name without being prompted, and the sound of it struck her with such force that she could not speak. She simply nodded and fled to her room, where she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands to her burning cheeks. She did not know what was happening. She did not trust it. The shift in him began slowly after that night. He appeared at breakfast, which he had previously taken alone in his study. He inquired stiffly about her plans for the day. He even accompanied her on a visit to the tenants one rainy afternoon, standing in the doorway of a cramped cottage while she knelt to spoon broth into the mouth of a sick child. He did not speak, but his eyes followed every gentle movement of her hands, and when they left he said gruffly, "You do this often." "I do it every week," she replied, pulling her cloak tighter against the drizzle. "There is much to be done." "I did not know." She stopped on the muddy path and turned to face him. "No, you did not." There was no malice in her voice, only a tired acceptance that hurt him more than any accusation could. She saw something flicker behind his silver eyes, a flinch, barely visible, before his expression smoothed back into its usual polite mask. She walked on, and after a moment he followed. The first real fracture came on a Sunday evening, 10 days before Henry was due to depart. Alara had spent the afternoon in the village overseeing the final repairs to the old cottage that would soon become the schoolhouse. She returned to Thornwood Hall exhausted, her hem muddy and her hair windswept, and entered through the side door to avoid the prying eyes of guests who had arrived for a small dinner party she had completely forgotten. She stopped in the shadowed corridor, her stomach dropping. Laughter and the clink of glasses drifted from the drawing room. She was still in her plain woolen day dress, her hands ink-stained from writing letters for an illiterate tenant farmer. Panic fluttered in her throat. She could not walk into a room full of aristocrats looking like a servant. She hovered in the hallway, half hidden behind a marble pillar, considering a retreat upstairs to change when Lady Margaret Crewe, a sharp-faced baroness, stepped out of the drawing room and spotted her. "Good heavens," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying with practiced cruelty. "Is that the Duchess? My dear, have you been digging in the garden?" A few heads turned. Heat flooded Alara's cheeks. She opened her mouth to explain, but no words came. Then Alexander appeared in the doorway behind Lady Margaret. He took in the scene in a single glance: his wife, rumpled and red-faced, the smirking baroness, the curious eyes beyond. For a heartbeat, Alara braced herself for the cold dismissal she had come to expect. He did not dismiss her. Instead, he stepped forward, positioning himself at her side. "My wife," he said, his voice clear and cutting as fine crystal, "has been overseeing the establishment of a school for the children of Thornwood's tenants, an endeavor that, I am certain, will outlast any of our small evening entertainments. If her appearance offends you, Lady Margaret, you are welcome to depart." The Baroness's smirk vanished. She stammered an apology and retreated into the drawing room. The curious heads turned away. Alara stared up at her husband. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the doorway where Lady Margaret had fled, a muscle ticking in his jaw. But his hand found hers briefly and pressed it. "Come," he said, quieter now. "You must be tired. I'll have a tray sent to your room." She nodded, not trusting her voice. She pulled her hand free and climbed the stairs with her heart thumping so loudly she thought it might echo through the silent corridors. Something was changing. She was afraid to believe it. The day Henry left, the air in Thornwood Hall grew heavier. He bade Alara farewell in the front drive, kissing her hand with a warmth that lingered a breath too long. "You deserve every happiness," he said softly, so that only she could hear. "Do not let this old stone house bury your light." She watched his carriage roll away, and when she turned, Alexander was standing in the open doorway, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. There was no anger in it, but something rawer, something almost wounded. "You will miss him," he said. It was not a question. "He was kind to me," she answered truthfully. "Kindness is not so plentiful here that I can afford to disregard it." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Alexander flinched visibly, and for the first time she saw his composure crack. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it and walked back inside. That night, unable to sleep, Alara wandered down to the library. She often sought refuge there when the darkness of her own thoughts grew too heavy. She lit a single candle and curled into the window seat, staring out at the moonlit gardens without truly seeing them. She did not hear him enter. She only sensed his presence when the candle flame wavered, and she turned to find Alexander standing a few feet away, still in his day clothes, his cravat loosened and his hair disheveled as if he had been raking his hands through it. "I could not sleep," he said, a rough confession. "Nor could I." He took a step closer, then stopped. "Alara, I owe you an apology." She held very still. "I have been absent," he continued, the words seeming to cost him. "I have treated you as a stranger in your own home. I did not intend cruelty, but I see now that my indifference was its own form of it." She should have felt triumph. Instead, she only felt a deep, weary ache. "Why now?" she asked. "Why do you see me now after all these months?" He struggled. She watched his throat move as he swallowed, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Because I almost lost you before I understood what I was losing," he said finally. "Henry looked at you as if you were a treasure, and I realized I had never once looked at you at all. I had been so consumed by the past, by obligations I never asked for, that I was blind." "The past," she echoed. He nodded, a bitter twist to his mouth. "When my parents died, I was 10 years old. I lost everything. My home, my security, my sense of who I was. I threw myself into duty because duty was the only thing that did not hurt. When I married you, it was a contract. I did not allow myself to see a woman only a transaction. I was a fool." A small, fragile hope began to stir in Alara's chest, but it was tangled with a deeper grief. He still did not know. He spoke of the past, and still he did not remember the little girl under the oak tree. The boy who had promised to marry her was not this man. That promise had died with his parents, buried under years of cold duty. "I am not a transaction," she said quietly. "I am your wife. I have always been here waiting. But I will not wait forever, Alexander. I cannot live on crumbs of attention when I have already given so much." "Given so much," his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She nearly told him then. The secret of the debt, the sold necklace, the years of silent love that had brought her to his doorstep. But fear sealed her lips. If she told him now, after his confession, it would seem like a demand for gratitude. It would cheapen everything. "Nothing," she whispered, "only that I am tired." He crossed the distance between them and knelt before the window seat, taking her cold hands in his. The gesture was so unexpected, so unlike the rigid Duke she knew, that her breath caught. "Then let me be the one who waits," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let me earn your trust. I do not know how to be a husband who deserves you, but I will learn, I swear it." Tears burned her eyes. She did not pull her hands away. She let him hold them, his grip warm and solid. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel a sliver of hope that was not immediately crushed by disappointment. The weeks that followed were a careful, tentative dance. Alexander did not transform overnight into a devoted romantic hero. He was still reserved, still prone to long silences and distracted frowns. But he came to breakfast every morning. He walked with her through the gardens and listened, truly listened, as she spoke of her school and her tenants. He began to ask questions, awkward and sincere, about her childhood in Somerset, though she was careful to omit any detail that might trigger a memory too soon. She found herself falling in love with him all over again, against every wall she had built around her heart. But this time, it was not the love of a starry-eyed girl clinging to a childhood promise. It was a woman's love, cautious and clear-eyed, for the complicated, flawed man he was becoming. And yet the two secrets lay between them like buried embers, waiting to ignite. The first ember sparked on a rainy Tuesday when Alexander decided to clear out an old storeroom in the East Wing. He had been in a strange mood all morning, restless, preoccupied, and he insisted on tackling the dusty task himself. Alara, curious, followed him to the cramped room where decades of forgotten belongings gathered cobwebs. She hovered in the doorway as he pried open a trunk that had belonged to his mother. He lifted out a small wooden box, its hinges rusted, and opened it. Inside lay a tangle of childhood treasures, a carved horse, a faded ribbon, a miniature portrait of a dark-haired boy she recognized as a young Alexander, and beneath it all a scrap of paper, yellowed with age. He unfolded it, his face went very still. "What is it?" she asked, moving closer. He did not answer. He was staring at the paper as if it were a ghost. She peered over his arm and saw a childish drawing, smudged and clumsy, two stick figures holding hands under a lopsided tree. Beneath it, in a boy's unsteady letters, were the words, "Me and Ellie, I promise." Her heart stopped. "Ellie," Alexander breathed, the name falling from his lips like a forgotten prayer. "I made a promise. I had forgotten her." Alara could not speak. Her throat was locked. This was the moment she had dreamed of for years, the moment he would finally remember. But now, seeing the bewilderment and dawning grief on his face, she felt no triumph, only a terrible tenderness. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and searching. "There was a girl in Somerset. I swore I would marry her. I was just a boy, but I meant it, and then my parents died and everything went dark and I forgot. How could I forget?" He pressed a hand to his forehead as if in physical pain. "She must have thought I abandoned her. She must have waited." "She did," Alara said softly. He stared at her, uncomprehending. She reached into the pocket of her gown, where she had carried the little silver ring every day since she first arrived at Thornwood. She had not worn it on her finger, fearing he would notice and question her before she was ready. Now she drew it out and held it on her open palm. "You gave me this," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Under the old oak at the edge of my father's orchard. You said you would come back. I waited 17 years, and then I married you, Alexander, and you did not know me." He looked from the ring to her face and the color drained from his cheeks. "Alara, Ellie, it was you. It has always been you." He reached for her then, his hands cupping her face as if she were made of something infinitely precious and unbearably fragile. His thumbs brushed the tears she had not realized were falling. "I forgot the only promise that ever mattered," he said hoarsely. "I married you and I did not see you. How can you ever forgive me?" She could have given him the easy answer, the one he desperately wanted, but she had lived in the shadow of his neglect for too long to offer cheap comfort. "I don't know," she whispered honestly. "I have loved you since I was 7 years old. I have loved you through years of silence and months of indifference. But I do not know if love alone can mend what was broken." He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a desperation that stole her breath. "Then let me try. Let me spend the rest of my life trying. I cannot undo the past, but I can fill every day of our future with the devotion I should have given you from the start." She let herself lean into him, just for a moment, and the iron band that had constricted her heart for so long loosened a fraction. But the second secret still lay coiled in the dark, waiting. The revelation of the benefactor came a week later, and it was not gentle. Alexander's London solicitor, Mr. Thorne, arrived at Thornwood Hall on a grey morning with a thick folder under his arm and a triumphant expression. Alara was in the morning room, writing letters to the village carpenter about school desks, when she heard raised voices from the study. She set down her pen and moved into the hallway, an inexplicable dread curling in her stomach. The study door was ajar. She could see Alexander standing behind his desk, his face a mask of shock, while Mr. Thorne laid papers before him. "After 5 years, Your Grace, we have finally traced the anonymous payment," the solicitor was saying. "The funds originated from the sale of a rather significant diamond necklace that belonged to the Pemberton family. The sale was arranged by a young woman matching the description of your wife, who was then Miss Alara Pemberton. The solicitor who handled the transaction has confirmed her identity under confidential terms. There can be no doubt. The Duchess is the benefactor you have sought." The silence that followed was so absolute that Alara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. Alexander looked at her, and his expression was one she would never forget. It held wonder, humiliation, awe, and a pain so deep it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. "You," he said, the word barely a whisper. "It was you who saved Thornwood. You sold your mother's jewels to pay my debts, and you never spoke a word. You married me, and I treated you as an inconvenience. You saved everything I have, and I did not even offer you common courtesy." Mr. Thorne, sensing the charged air, murmured an excuse and slipped from the room, closing the door behind him. Alara stood motionless in the middle of the study, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I did not want your gratitude," she said, her voice thin but clear. "I did it because I could not bear the thought of you losing your home. The boy I loved lived here. I could not let his legacy crumble." "The boy you loved," Alexander repeated. He came around the desk, his steps unsteady, and stopped before her. "You loved a boy who forgot you. You saved a man who ignored you. What did I ever do to deserve such a sacrifice?" "You did nothing," she said, and now a thread of iron entered her voice, the strength she had forged in her long months of solitude. "That is the point, Alexander. Love is not something you earn. It is something you give. I gave it freely, without condition. The question is whether you can accept a love you did not deserve." He sank to his knees before her, right there on the study floor, his pride stripped away, his silver eyes bright with unshed tears. He took her hands and pressed his forehead against them, his shoulders bowed. "I am not worthy," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I am not worthy, but I am begging you, Alara Ellie, to let me try to become worthy. Not because I owe you a debt, but because I have come to love you with a love that terrifies me. I love your quiet strength. I love the way you care for those who cannot repay you. I love the sound of your voice in the morning and the light in your eyes when you speak of your school. I love you, and I am more afraid of losing you than I have ever been of anything in my life." She looked down at the proud, powerful Duke kneeling at her feet, his dark head bent in surrender, and she felt the last wall around her heart begin to dissolve. "I need time," she whispered, "time to trust this, time to heal." "Take all the time you need," he said into her hands. "I will be here. I will wait for you the way you waited for me. I will wait forever if I must." She did not make him wait forever, but she did not rush into his arms either. The weeks that followed were a slow, deliberate rebuilding. Alexander kept his word with a diligence that astonished the entire household. He cleared his schedule of unnecessary business. He walked with her to the village every morning and helped carry supplies for the school. His fine coats growing dusty and his hands calloused from manual labor he had never before attempted. He sat with the blind old farmer and listened to stories that had nothing to do with ledgers or politics. He learned the names of the tenant children and brought them sweets that made them squeal with delight. And at night he would find her in the library and they would talk, not about duty or obligation, but about small, precious things. Her favorite color, the wildflowers that grew in her mother's garden, the way the light fell on the Somerset Hills in autumn. He told her about the dark years after his parents' deaths, the loneliness that had calcified into coldness, the terror of opening his heart to anyone. She listened without judgment, and slowly the last shadows between them began to lift. One evening, as summer softened into early autumn and the gardens blazed with golden light, Alexander led her to the old oak tree that stood at the far edge of the Thornwood grounds. It was not the same oak from her childhood, but it was ancient and gnarled and beautiful, and he had hung a small silver lantern from one of its low branches. The lantern flickered with candlelight, casting dancing shadows on the grass. "I wanted to bring you back to the beginning," he said, his voice low and earnest. "To the promise I broke. I want to make a new promise here now with no ghosts between us." He reached into his pocket and drew out a ring, not the little silver band of childhood, but a ring of sapphire and diamond that had belonged to his mother. He had shown it to her once, a treasured heirloom he had never thought to offer anyone. "Ilara," he said, her name a caress, "I promised you once as a boy who did not understand what vows meant. I promise you now as a man who understands everything. I promise to see you, every day, for the rest of my life. I promise to cherish the love you gave so freely when I deserved it least. I will spend every breath I have proving that your sacrifice was not in vain. Will you let me be your husband truly from this moment forward?" Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. She held out her left hand, steady and sure, and watched him slide the sapphire ring onto her finger beside the simple gold band she already wore. The two rings together, old and new, felt like a circle closing at last. "Yes," she said, "I will, but you must promise me one thing more." "Anything." "Promise me you will never again forget that I am here. That I am not a shadow, not a duty, not a transaction. I am your wife, and I will stand beside you, but I will not disappear for your convenience ever again." He drew her into his arms, his embrace fierce and gentle all at once. "You are the very center of my world," he murmured into her hair. "I was a fool to ever look past you. Never again. I swear it on my life." She closed her eyes and let herself finally, completely, believe him. The lantern light flickered above them, and the old oak creaked softly in the breeze, as if bearing witness to a vow that had been 17 years in the making. In the months that followed, the changes in Thornwood Hall were visible to all. The tenants spoke warmly of the Duke and Duchess who visited together, hand in hand, their smiles no longer separate but shared. The village school opened with a celebration that drew families from miles around, and Ilara stood at the door greeting each child by name, while Alexander distributed slates and chalk, his ducal dignity set aside for the simple joy of service. The great house itself seemed to breathe again, its cold corridors filled with laughter and the scent of fresh flowers that Ilara arranged herself. And late at night, when the house was quiet and the moon hung low over the gardens, Alexander would sometimes wake and reach for her, his hand finding hers in the darkness, and he would whisper her name, both of her names, as if they were a prayer he would never tire of saying. "Ellie Ilara, my heart." She would turn toward him, nestling into the warmth of his chest, and the last ache of those lonely years would ease into a quiet, enduring peace. The road behind them had been long and stony, but the path ahead stretched bright and green, and they walked it together, never again out of step. And the people who knew their story would later say that the Duke of Thornwood became known not for his wealth or his power, but for the way he looked at his wife, as though she were the dawn after an endless night, and he had finally learned to open his eyes.